just like to give you a brief presentation on some work we completed in June this year in terms of admitted flow. We actually looked at 11 hospitals during the month of June who were believed to be quite high performing. We had an assessment of our data relating to length of stay and 4-hour performance, and these 11 hospitals came out as being the most high performing across the NHS in England. The visits were, and the review was focused on admitted flow and mainly around pathway 0, but we did have an eye on sort of the whole UEC pathway. So the organisations that we visited were Barnsley, Bradford, Dartford and Gravesham, East Lancashire, East Suffolk and North Essex, Homerton, Kettering, Newcastle, Northumbria, North Tees, Royal Surrey and University College Hospital in London. So you can see it was quite a busy month for us in June. So the terms of reference really for the review were threefold. They were to gather intelligence on what factors and characteristics these organisations seem to have that made them high performing in terms of UEC and patient flow. We wanted to understand the local application of known good practice in things like discharge to assess and pathways 0 to 3, but specifically on pathway 0 on this occasion. And we wanted to harvest tools, techniques and experience that might be shared across the wider NHS in improving patient flow. So to do that, we had some kind of key lines of inquiry that we used to influence our discussions with the teams that we visited. We wanted to understand in more detail really what the vision and shared purpose was for UEC and for patient flow across that organisation. We want to understand leadership and how that actually factored into the operational management of the hospital. The use of data and information and how these particular organisations use data to not only operationally manage but to improve flow. How they coordinated and coordinate the care across the whole UEC pathway. And in terms of internal professional standards and the adoption of good practice. So whilst we didn't follow these slavishly, we actually used them as a key line of inquiry really in terms of our reviews. Chris.
Thanks very much, Mark. So hopefully you can hear me perfectly all right. I'm looking for a nod, Mark. My internet, yes, I got a nod. My internet's been playing up something chronic, as I'm sure we've all shared. So the next few slides are basically the themes that we found when we went to these high-performing organisations. They're not in any priority order, and they're certainly not a list of recommendations. However, let's just look at this factually. These are the themes that the top-performing organisations in the whole of the English NHS have in relation to admitted flow. So if you're not interested in perhaps some of these themes, you'd probably have to come up with a really good solid reason as to why you want to discount them, because they all share them. So hopefully there is something in that. So, and a lot of these findings actually were fairly common if you've seen the previous presentation that we did last year on the top performing organisations around ambulance handover delays. There's some commonality there, and you'll see this first slide is one of those. So executive leadership. So when we went into these organisations, staff, and what we mean by staff is non-executive staff at the coalface in multiple clinical areas. They said that they saw their executives on a daily basis, and their executives for them demonstrate the values that they think that their organisation is about, and they drive the values of the culture within that organisation. They see them on a daily, weekly basis. They were able to name them. They knew what jobs that they did. They saw them in site management meetings. They just saw them throughout the organisation. And what was really lovely, especially the emotional me aspect, that is, it was really lovely to hear them described in such human ways. So staff described their executives as caring, accessible. They listen to us. They listen to patients. They get involved. But most importantly, they give us permission. If we think we've got a good idea, then we're allowed to run with it. They empower us rather than tell us what to do. And staff, what was really interesting as well, staff were able to, when we went and spent time with them, they talked to us about the way that we work in this organisation, the things that we've got zero tolerances for, what we will or won't stand for. When we met the executives in the morning, that's what we were told. But when we went out on the shop floor areas, these same sentences were echoed by healthcare assistants, nurses, doctors, AHPs. So there's something significant between the connection between leadership at an executive level defining the culture of an organisation. And we found that very much in these 11 organisations. Next slide. Again, no preferential order. So a long time ago, I was a site manager. It was a long time. It's the thinnest I've ever been in my life because the amount of miles I got under my belt. My site meetings didn't look like the picture you've got on screen. I had a clipboard and a pen with lots and lots of crossings out. And for the old ones smiling on the presentation today, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Nowadays, they look very, very different. And in these 11 organisations, it looks like something out of Star Trek, where you've got, excuse me, where you've got all these digital solutions in front of you. And what really took us when we went into these op centres is that there is a digital solution for pretty much every element of performance and flow, not just inside the hospital, but they've got connectivity out into the systems. And these are organisations that are part of systems that really have visibility of its component parts. They all understand what their risk is. They all understand what is flowing along the whole of the UEC pathway, not just from the front door of the hospital. And when it comes down to the hospital level, these site meetings and site managers are able to look at information about specific patients down to an almost molecular level. They're able to look at ward environments, what patients are in those wards, what those patients are waiting for. Now, there wasn't necessarily one digital solution at all of these 11 places, but what they had done is that they had either designed their own software or they'd bought software in. But the common theme is that they were all able to see in a live way what was going on inside their organisation in all the services, but then also a live way as to what's going on in the system. The site meetings themselves were mostly virtual. They were attended by a cast of thousands, maybe not quite thousands, but they were certainly attended by quite a few people. But what we saw is significant divisional management and clinical representation. The system partners were there as well. And we often saw directors and executives present, but they weren't dictating, they weren't taking over. They were there and they were seen there as a supportive measure to empower the wider group. So site meetings that we all know, we know that these are often places where difficulties in flow are discussed, where problems are brought and solutions are sought. But in these organisations, when we observed these site meetings, we genuinely felt, and they described themselves, that they have a collaboration around those problems. So one person's problem is everybody's problem. And they look at flow not necessarily as this mechanisation of care, but actually the management of risk. And it's everybody's job to look after patients as a whole along that pathway and to support each other. Now, we've said that there was strong divisional representation, but we also noted there was strong MDT representation. So it wasn't just nurses, it wasn't just managers. We genuinely saw nurses, AHPs, doctors and managers all at site meetings. And that's not necessarily just at Opal 4 or Opal 3. They are a constant. And after all, what we were told is that this is about the management of risk, and who better to look after risk than the advice of clinicians themselves. The site meetings were structured, they were snappy, they were often action focused, and people really understood what their role was and where they were bringing things back. And that was the case in all of these 11 organisations. Next slide. So it seems a little bit perverse, this slide, but because specifically we went in to look at admitted flow. So you'd think we'd concentrate on the admitted areas of a hospital. But when, as we've said in the preamble to this presentation, we wanted to objectively walk the pathway, but we also wanted to ask leaders and staff within these organisations, why do you think you're so good at admitted flow? And the response that we got from pretty much all of them is that they genuinely believe that the success they have in admitted flow is because they only let patients into admission beds that genuinely need a bed and need hospital-based care. So these are organisations and systems that have worked incredibly hard and continue to do so on admission avoidance and even conveyance avoidance to hospital. So they've done a lot of work on care coordination hubs, making sure that there are estates and systems in place so that people are, so you'd have things like call to convey, call before convey, frailty, silver lines, etc., where there is information and provision of advice before you even take the patient out of their own home. There's very strong urgent community response teams, and certainly what we saw is a lot of them were integrated trusts. But we saw on the hospital site primary care, urgent care and community care partners working throughout the 7 days on the hospital site. So there was definitely a collaboration rather than a UEC pathway made up of parts. It was one larger team. Now, with all this connectivity, you obviously have, well, how do I get patient A into service B? And what we noted for the majority in these organisations is that there is a hypothesis of having open access criteria. So whilst there is a couple of exclusion criteria for the being able to access into different services, the majority of them are based on trust. So for example, I can see the lovely Rebecca Elson there. Hello, Rebecca. So Rebecca is a clinician. She's working out in the community. I look after a service in the hospital. Well, Rebecca might ring me and say, I've got this patient. I think in my clinical duty, in my competency, I think that this patient could be for you. Can we have a chat about them? And the general response in these 11 organisations is that me, Chris, I go, yeah, no problems. I trust that you've rung me for a reason. I trust you're competent, and there must be a good reason that you've reached out for my advice. So we're going to work together. I'm not going to look at a flowchart of a list of access, inclusion or exclusion criteria. And that was the case throughout these organisations. Just ring each other and have a chat and do the best by patients. Next slide. So along the same theme as admission avoidance, obviously there's that thing around stopping patients getting to hospitals if they don't need it. But of course, we have a lot of unheralded activity as well, and that makes its way to the front door, often to ED and to streaming. Now, the commonality between these organisations is that they are very, very heavy and hot on streaming. And so streaming needs multiple things to work. So it not only does it need a workforce, a constant workforce that has the ability to stream, and some smaller organisations or more tight restrictions around workforce, you might combine streaming and triage function together, which actually some of these did. But fundamentally, there is the ability to stream a patient to the right place for what the patient requires. And so, for example, that could be to same-day emergency care, to urgent treatment centres or co-located equivalents, to assessment areas, frailty specialities, to a variety of different places. Now, some of these organisations stream up to 60% of their total activity coming into ED. And if you think about that, that's quite big. But they successfully do it because they've empowered that workforce to do it. So in order for streaming to work, you've got to have a workforce, they've got to be competent and trained to do it, they've got to be empowered by the organisation, given permission that you do the right thing, we trust you, but then the doorways themselves have to be open, and the access criteria to those doorways has to be fairly transparent and open to encourage a culture of open access criteria. So generally in these organisations, it's easy to stream patients, it's easy to refer them and transfer them. And again, back to this high culture of trust, is that in these organisations, and I'm sorry to say that I don't always see this when we go on our travels, is that in these organisations, people don't question or go behind the decision making of the streamers, whereas perhaps in more challenged organisations, it's a battle and people tend not to keep on trying when they're fighting. But definitely streaming was a big thing. Next slide. Again, on the theme of admission avoidance, again, a little bit of a perverse slide here, is that you just admitted somebody, but then you're already thinking about discharging them. Well, in these organisations, that's a thing. So their discharge planning starts from the very first moment the patient starts to get over the threshold. So we saw evidence of documentation around discharge being part of the ED pack. So the moment they arrive, we're starting to think about how do we safely get them home. And that also couples with conversations. Now, the people doing those conversations can change from organisation to organisation, but we definitely saw themes of therapists and community partners working in ED, and in some cases working 24 hours a day. So that there are conversations with, again, I'm going to pick on you, Rebecca, sorry. Rebecca comes into ED and it looks like she might stay for a couple of days. Well, the moment she's come in, we're going to say to her, you're probably going to go home in a couple of days. Can you foresee any issue to you getting home in 2 days' time? Have you still got your keys? Have you got carers or some kind of support package that we need to make sure doesn't stop so that it can pick up in those 2 days? These organisations are really proactive in those conversations and in that planning, so that worst case scenario discharge planning doesn't start to happen when you hit the ward. It's already begun. What was really quite nice is that most of these organisations put a strong emphasis on reducing health inequalities. They're quite advanced in regards to making sure that they really understand the demographics of their clientele, and to see where perhaps the automation of care or admissions might be defaulting, and that may not be doing justice to some patient groups. So the most immediate one there is frailty in the older patient, is that we know if we get a frail or older patient into bed, they're very much more likely to decondition, they're much more likely to go up the scales of the pathway 1, 2 and 3, and therefore cause problems with our length of stay, never mind the problems for the patients themselves. These organisations are really strongly thinking about those health inequalities and making sure services are driving down unnecessary admissions in those areas. Next slide. Thanks, Mark. So you've noticed we've skipped a bit, is that we're not really doing anything on ED or the assessment units, because it's a given that those areas, their bread and butter is to try and make sure that they discharge as much as possible and not allow stuff to get through to the admitting environment. Obviously, the more crowded they get, the more difficult that gets for them. But either way, we've skipped over those and looked and gone on to the ward processes or the inpatient ward environment. So there's a few things here. So the first bullet relates to culture. So when we went into these 11 organisations, a fairly consistent theme was the language that ward staff used. So they saw flow not as some kind of mechanisation. They saw flow in terms of risk. They said that where flow falters, we're increasing risk to patients through a variety of ways. But in essence, it's our duty as ward staff to make sure that there is flow throughout the organisation and into our ward environment, because emergency care and flow is not just ED's problem, it's not just AMU's problem, it's all of our problem that all of us need to solve. Now, the second bullet, I kind of personally, I don't mind being honest about these things, I kind of expected that the 11 most successful organisations on admitted flow and in the ward environment would be talking to us about SAFER, the Safer Patient Flow Bundle, which I know most of us, if not all of us, know about. But what was really interesting and learning for me is that whilst all of these 11 organisations were able to refer to or recognise the Safer Patient Flow Bundle, what they'd all done, though, is that they weren't living now by SAFER. They'd used that as a springboard to co-design and create something that really worked for that, bespoke for that organisation. So whilst it had the same principles of SAFER, i.e. around ward rounds and board rounds and senior decision makers and having that home first culture, is that they had come together as an organisation, as an MDT, to design collaboratively, how are we going to work here and how are we going to make sure that all of our wards work in the same way. And that particularly credit has to go to not only the executive of these organisations, but also specifically the medical staff, the doctor world. Because perhaps historically, if the doctors on this call don't mind me saying this, is that perhaps ward rounds historically have been more doctor-led. But if doctors are specifically collaboratively minded, they empower their nursing and AHP colleagues and administrative staff to speak up, And in these organisations, we went and observed multiple board and ward rounds, and we saw collaboration in practice. We saw that often these rounds were led not just by doctors, but some cases nurses and AHPs. But everybody just worked collaboratively together. There was a collapsible hierarchy, and that they were all focused on challenging each other in an appropriate way, but in ensuring that patients do not stay in hospital unless they don't have to stay in hospital. And they were all minded of ensuring that the principles of SAFER were embedded in some way. And how that fed into the culture is that we kept on hearing reference of, well, that's not how we do things here. That's the way we do things here. That's the way we work. And you got that there was some kind of universal culture that held everybody to account. Each and every person held each and every person to account. And so it's almost like they were a school of fish swimming seamlessly together. And they did talk occasionally. There's a salmon in their midst, but they collaboratively work around that salmon to turn them back into the trout, if I'm allowed to use that kind of analogy. But this was a culture of they hold each other to account, which was done in a really supportive way. Further on the ward environment piece is that we saw teams working the same no matter which ward that we went to, so there was that standardized approach. But equally is that if somebody needs a senior decision review over a weekend, or they need some kind of care or therapy work over the weekend, they've got 7-day consultant and therapist working throughout the week. And so there isn't a huge difference, as there is with more challenged organizations, between discharges and flow during the weekdays than there is at weekends. And then lastly, another thing I was personally quite surprised about is I thought that by visiting these 11 organizations, we wouldn't see outliers as a thing, but actually only one of the 11 has got a zero tolerance to outlying. The rest of them do. But these 10 that do, they have got very, very strong processes around how an outlier is put in an outlier situation. So that what we mean by this is patients not going to their speciality owned wards or environments. So they've come up with ways to ensure that patients who sometimes in more challenged organizations will get another day or two added onto their length of stay because they're outliers. In these organizations, they are prioritized, and there is mechanizations to ensure that those patients are seen early and decisions are made early and things are chased early for them. So next slide. Following on from the inpatient ward processes, there is again rippled all the way through this element of team empowerment, this collapsible hierarchy, people working together. But on the second bullet, there was a split. And I think this goes back to the fact that there are many different ways it's possible to successfully deliver flow or deliver care along the UEC pathway. It's just to make sure that there's a conscious design and that everybody signs up to it. So the 11 hospitals that we visited split into 3 camps in regards to, well, who looks after the discharge process in a ward environment. So camp 1, the organisations think that this is definitely a nursing piece, and nurses need to be freed up to ensure that they chase discharges and manage the discharge process. However, camps 2 and 3, they have roles, and they're called different things in different places, but we know them as discharge coordinators or flow coordinators, and they may have a collection of wards or one ward, but in essence they help to manage the discharge process. So in camp 2, the discharge coordinators, or their equivalent, whatever they're called, they focus just on the complex discharge patients, and they say they do this because it frees up nursing time, and the nurses then look to do basic care and also perhaps the more straightforward discharges. But camp 3 differs again in the fact those discharge coordinator roles, they manage all discharge pieces and discharge flow decisions and discharge chasing, and they say that's because that frees up nursing then to really concentrate on basic nursing ward care. So I've already mentioned about the therapy and consultant 7-day cover in these organisations. But in a lot of these types of presentations, people like Mark and I, we get asked, well, we kind of know what. We know the what that needs to be done, but we often don't know the how. That's what we need help with. How have these organizations managed to get to this Elysium, to this point of success? And so we asked that question when we visited each of these areas, and the answer was pretty much the same in all 11. So all of these 11 say that they have got to this point because they've had some form of significant executive-led QI methodology piece that's been sustainably worked upon over the last 1 to 2 years that has delivered them some kind of sustained ward processes piece. So they all started off, and whether they got a private consultation firm in or whether it is their own in-house QI team or transformation team, they all started with getting the MDT together to discuss, well, what do we want to do and why are we doing it and what should we co-design to create, and then how are we all going to keep ourselves to account in the delivery of that. And they said that there was lots of bumps along the road, but it took a couple of years, 1 to 2 years. And there's a message in there for all of you and for all of us, is there is no quick win, it would seem, about really knuckling down on admitted flow. This is about really going for it, and sustainably so, over a couple of years. Last little learning point from me on ward processes, which surprised me, is that nobody in these 11 had cracked criteria-led discharge. They had in surgery, but then most of us have done that in surgery. But specifically in medicine, none of them say that they've delivered criteria-led discharge in medicine, but they are still trying. Next slide. We gave this slide its own slide because although it's kind of seen as a bit cliched and a bit soft, we genuinely felt this was something as a theme that came out of these organizations, and it was around the people aspect. So we saw, as I've already described, this wonderfully strong culture. No matter where we went or who we spoke to, is that everybody was on the same page, and there was just a really strong ripple of good ABCs, these attitudes, behaviors and culture. There must have been something specific done by these organizations to really drive forward that positive environment. Now, its third bullet is something, again, that really surprised me. One should never really go into situations thinking you know everything, because clearly you don't. So we're cheating by showing you on the screen here. But if I was to ask you this question, is do you think that if you visited the 11 highest performing organizations in the country on flow, do you think that they would have written down internal professional standards for specialities and different departments on how they work? Well, I would have said that they would. They must have really strong internal professional standards. But when we asked to see them in these organizations, for the majority, they said, well, we don't have them. And when we asked, well, how come? They said that for them, writing things down in a flowchart and forcing their clinical teams to follow a flowchart is almost insulting. They said that we work much more heavily on the culture, in that we all understand what's the right thing to do, and let's all work together to make sure the right thing is done. And they said that they've stepped away from things like internal professional standards because that's missing the point. It's holding people to a flowchart as opposed to holding people to a cultural, this is the way we all want to work. Now, there are obviously, for those of you who are not from those organizations on the call, that's obviously a huge stepping stone. And I think it's fair to say that most of these organizations, they might not have the IPS written down, but they have at some stage come together as a collaborative to say, well, how are we going to work together, and how are we going to work here in this organization? So whilst there may not be the standardized flowcharts, there is definitely internal professional standards as part of their given culture. We also saw little escalation usage. So in more challenged organizations, or at least on challenge days, I think we'd all agree that if we're in a site meeting, we would hear about escalations of where patients are not necessarily getting what they need to. So the classic is, Bob is waiting for a scan and he's been waiting 2 days now. And we just didn't see that. And we asked about it, and they said, well, we don't really have escalation within our organizations. And the reason for that is that why does a director or an executive need to know that somebody needs a scan? Is that we would much rather everybody recognizes that somebody needs a scan or somebody needs something, and actually services and organizations just help each other out. And they try to aim towards doing the right thing rather than reporting it back to some central command. So there were times where escalation was used, but for the majority, again, it goes back to culture. These organizations empower people and power services to find solutions themselves without the need to go up the chain and fall into that perhaps more dictatorial way of, or command and control way of working. Now, the last thing is a little bit contentious, so I hope I phrased this right, and I hope you're with me in the way I'm going to phrase this. So we just felt like these 11 organizations have really spent a lot of time and thought and energy into making sure that their staff are okay. So we saw a whole range of staff welfare, empowerment, engagement, OD pieces, ranging from canteens that were serving hot food for 24 hours to drop-in sessions in staff receiving areas, with executives to talk about anything that they wanted to collaboration spaces, to recognition, daily recognition pieces, to open events, they just had a strategy around the ethos, and I think it's Richard Branson's ethos. And whilst we all understand that patients are incredibly important, there's a kind of message from these organizations that if you don't look after your staff are the ones that look after your customers. And so how can we possibly expect our customers to have the best experience if we're not treating our staff in the best way? And these organizations, they kept on talking about making sure that their staff were all right and that there was feedback from their staff. And on the subject of feedback, these organizations score some of the highest staff feedback scores nationally. So again, it's not necessarily a recommendation, but there's got to be something in there, hasn't there? Next slide. So this is my last one before I hand over to Mark. So yes, we went in and looked at admitted flow, and so we've done a little bit around war processes there and about operations. But actually is that there's the same old message that came back from the ambulance handover visits as well, is that you cannot look at one necessary part on the UEC pathway in silo without tipping a hat to earlier parts and later parts, because it's one domino effect. They all affect each other. And so in the same way, what we did is we looked up and down the pathway, and we noticed that there were similarities between these organizations around the admitted pathway piece. So all of them had got a significant SDEC offer. All of them have very large takes that go through the SDEC with good conversion rates. All of the SDECs have got nice open access criteria rather than these long exclusion-inclusion lists. And HCPs out in the community can easily access those SDEC environments, either virtually or physically. All of them have got co-located UTCs or some kind of equivalent to that, so that ED is not managing massive flows of patients or becoming crowded. They all offer quite a mature version or level of streaming, where streamers are empowered and there's multiple doorways that streamers can send patients through. As I said earlier in the presentation, sending up to 60% of total activity for the day to other places other than ED. Key thing is that specialities in these organizations take their patients to their own areas. We kept on hearing words to the effect of the emergency department is an emergency department. It's not an assessment department. And so if somebody's coming in for a specialty, they need to go to a specialty area. And these divisions that are alongside ED have come up with estates and solutions where their own patients are seen outside of ED unless they need some kind of resuscitation. They've all got strong acute medical models. They all differ in some way. And it's, again, that whole ethos that it's possible to design something bespoke for an organization, so you don't have to standardize one size fits all. But what they all had in common is that whatever they decided was the maximum length of stay for their acute medical model, they stuck to it. So if you're not supposed to stay longer than 72 hours on AMU, then you do not for the majority in these organizations. And then the last thing to say is that there was a very clear strategy and use of virtual wards. People still may need care, but they don't necessarily need that care in an acute environment. And so these organizations are very much thinking about virtual wards and looking after people in their own homes. So those were the kind of the main themes. We'll share these slides, but to finish off there, back to Mark.
Thanks, Chris. So what were the main characteristics really that these organizations had in terms of consistency. And it was very clear across the 11 that they were able to articulate a very, very clear current and future state, a vision for where they wanted to go and where they wanted to be. And I think there was also consistency, and that was always underpinned by a very compelling evidence-based narrative. And no matter who you talk to, you'd actually get that same narrative as to a future vision and a shared vision. Very clear leadership in each of the organizations, not just in terms of operational leadership and executive leadership. There was very strong clinical leadership in the organizations, and they were also able to describe a very compelling narrative of where they wanted to go. And that was always evidence-based and based around harm and quality and safety. It was actually their use of information, and it was very clear that not only did they use activity information, but they were also able to use information to operationally manage through things like predictive methodology, and also to improve as well. So there was a really consistent way of actually how they use information. As a nurse, I was many years ago. I was in my training, I was taught about the airway, breathing, and circulation, the ABCs. But as an improvement manager, it's really, really obvious to me now that the determining factor for success is the attitude, behaviour, and culture of the organisation, and that was in spades really in the 11 organisations we went to, and that kind of played out in role playing and role modelling and other things. So, in terms of the application of internal professional standards, as Chris has said, that went beyond the SOP, and it was actually business as usual. When we went to the ward rounds, they were all standardized and they were all working to the same pace in the same way. The organizations also clearly had adopted best practice quite rapidly, and they were able to sustain it, again, beyond SOPs and beyond anything in that respect. And they also had a very clear understanding of the human factors that affected patient flow and the management of sort of simple discharge. So that was a kind of clear message really we got from all the executive and clinical teams. So they were the kind of 8 consistent factors that really shone out to us as being why they were high performing. So in my team, in ESIST, we're often asked what the silver bullet is in terms of improving admitted flow, but we kind of view it as more silver shrapnel. So basically small marginal gains that you can make across the whole pathway will bring about the more sustainable change. It's quite clear in the hospitals we visited that to get sustainable models, it requires a lot of dialogue pre-hospital, in-hospital, leadership and cultural interventions. But again, we'll come back to it. I know we've laboured on this quite a lot. The strong executive leadership and clinical leadership and daily oversight was a key determining factor in these hospitals. And obviously we've talked about, and Chris has talked about, the co-designed approach to ward processes. But the one thing that was consistent in all of the 11 organizations, bar one if I remember, was that they were integrated with the community, and they really maximized on the potential to not only develop services, but the integration allowed them to operationally manage. And as Chris has mentioned, a lot of the community services were completely embedded at the assessment process and onto the wards, and they were able to offer and coordinate care to improve simple discharge. So that's been a quick canter through our sort of review, and we've left some time now for some Q&A, and we'd be happy to help.
Thanks, Mark. I think just before we go on to Q&A, we have Liz. Are you there? I'm hoping Liz is. She is. So Liz is going to introduce herself, but we thought it would be useful for you to be introduced to Liz and to have a chat with her.
Thanks very much, Chris, and good afternoon, everybody. Hi, my name is Liz Rutherford. I run the Admitted Flow programme for NHS England on a national basis. And one of the things that we're taking forward from into what we're expecting to be a national flow bundle to be launched at the beginning of September is the work and the outputs of the visits that Chris, Mark and colleagues have undertaken. So I wanted to let you know that first of all, you clearly are going to get an awful lot from what Mark and Chris have talked through, and I've had the privilege to hear a bit more feedback from these visits as well. There's some fantastic learning in there, and we want to take that forward and make more of it available to you through a flow bundle. But also we really want to hear from you about what is and isn't useful. Very conscious that we can kind of produce an awful lot of stuff from national programs, but we want it to be useful, we want it to be helpful, and therefore would welcome any all feedback from you about what has and hasn't worked for you to get good flow in your organisation. So what I'm going to do, because we're going to leave the Q&As for the presentation and the visits, because I'm sure you've got lots of questions about those, but I'm going to put in the chat the email address of my programme. So if you'd like to have a bit of a conversation with one of me and my colleagues, I'd really welcome that. I'm also going to put the dates and times of a couple of focus groups that we've got coming up in the next couple of weeks. If you would like to attend one of those, we'd really always welcome colleagues' views and input to try and make what our national offer on the flow bundle will be as strong and as useful to you as possible. And I will be quiet. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Liz. If my internet cuts out, Mark, then Mark will very kindly take over. We're all got gremlins at some point, haven't we, on Teams? So the rest of the time is your time. So if anybody's got any questions or any comments that you'd like to make, you don't have to. But the whole piece of this work was around us going and digging on your behalf. So if there's anything specific you would like to pick our brains on, then you're very welcome to. You can put that in the chat or stick your hand up, and I will fill for a couple more seconds just to see if there is anything. So whilst you're still thinking, yes, we've got some. That's brilliant. Fantastic. So I don't know who went first. Michelle, I think it's over to you.
Hi, and thanks for the presentation. There's lots of really great food for thought in there, and I suppose the organisation that I work at, I think there's a recognition that particularly in our board rounds, there's something we need to do to support the reduction of the hierarchy. So you've mentioned this a couple of times in your presentation, and I think there's quite a complex history of how we've got to a point where our board rounds are really efficient in how they're run, but they're not quite as collaborative as they could be. And I wondered if you've seen any examples of, you've mentioned human factors a couple of times today, if there's been any specific work that people have done around the psychological safety in board rounds part, because I feel like that's a bit of a barrier. It's sometimes about ability to kind of challenge and that be accepted in a really helpful, critical friend manner.
Mark, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I think it's a really interesting one, because obviously, whilst we seek some standardization in terms of board rounds, there are many human factors at play in that whole process. I think Chris has referred to earlier about the how and the what. We know what to do. We can write an SOP for that. We know how to do it, but it's like sometimes we don't really invest so much in the why, and actually working with people to understand why running a board round in such a way will bring about more benefit. So I think there's something about the human factors about getting people to really understand the why it's important. Why is criteria to reside, for example, a good improvement tool and not simply a data collection exercise? And it's going through that kind of process, I think, that can really help. It's more the why.
So I'm just looking where you're geographically located, Michelle. The really good examples of what you're asking aren't particularly close, but we could link you up. I would, it's not miles and miles away, but there was a cluster of them together in the northeast. So Gateshead, North Tees, Northumbria. So that's not much of a huge drive in comparison to the rest of the country for you. And that might be something, because those three, and Newcastle as well, but specifically the first three, they all enjoy very, very strong cultures, collaborative cultures. And my take is that it all starts with role modeling at a senior level first. So if you're Koo and you're Don and you're MD, all appear to be equals, and that you can't get a piece of paper between the three of them, and they're setting a cultural tone, is that then their generals, if you want to talk about a military sense, their generals in the organization, they tend to follow suit with their MDT. And then when you start rippling it down, it just is, it's not something you have to address. It just, that's the way we work here. But I think if you were wanting to know, well, how do I influence that beginning in my own organization? It's probably the best thing you can do is to go into the organizations that are much further down the line and maybe sort of just phrase that question to them. Yeah. So Michelle, if you want to reach out to Mark or I, we can introduce you to your equivalents in any of those organizations, and you can start the conversational journey there.
Thank you very much.
No worries.
I've just say, Michelle, just before we lose that one, it's just there was a consistently big issue in that the focus is on pathway 0, but a lot of the focus naturally was on pathways 1 to 3, of 2 to 3. So that very small proportion of patients who are more complex. So I think it's difficult at the moment to get some standardization when that focus is on the problems of 2 and 3 in terms of social care and domiciliary care and things like that. So yeah, it's a work in progress.
And Michelle, I can see in the chat, Catherine came on the Northeast visits with us, and she's one of the lead sort of admitted flow discharge clinicians in the Northeast. She's happy to say hello to you. So if you want to link in with her on the chat and swap addresses, then she's lovely. She's really nice. She's good fun to be with for a day. Beryl.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, afternoon everyone. Thank you for the really great presentation, some really good stuff in there. I guess my question was just about, you referenced a commonality across organisations was that were integrated with community care. Is that because they were formally structured integrated trusts, or is it just the way the culture and the ways of working was integrated? Because I'd be interested in understanding how you can generate that kind of culture across organisations that you have, where we've multiple place directors and multiple social care providers, just trying to pull that together and thinking about how we could do that.
Go on, Mark.
So there's a theme here, Chris, isn't there? so I think it was just an observation to start off with, is that as we moved around the organisations, that there was a consistent thing that they were integrated in terms of one trust, as it were. I think in terms of the culture, it was just it was more about how they used how community services worked with the acute trust to actually bring about the best inpatient flow. So in many of the hospitals we went to, they were very comprehensive directories of service that were backed up by community staff actually attending the board rounds, for example, community staff actually being present in the assessment units and the ED. So from an integration point of view, I don't think I could answer your full question, Beryl, but certainly having some integration in terms of the community rather than having two separate trusts was a consistent feature.
And if I was going to add on to that, Beryl, just from my personal take, is that, so yes, for this admitted flow piece, a lot of them were integrated. For the ambulance handover one we did last year, half of the 16 were integrated. So clearly there's something about integration. But I wonder whether it's too easy to get lost in oh, well, they're integrated. Because when we had conversations with them, I think the fact that they're integrated was just a hat tip towards it was easier to work together. And it's not necessarily about being integrated. It's about having the ethos of we're one team and let's work together. So I think that in an integrated trust, it's a given that you've got to work together. And perhaps it's a little bit harder in a non-integrated trust, but it's by all means, it's not impossible, is it? And so I think that it's less about chasing integrated and more about how do we properly work together as a system. And certainly from the ambulance piece is that the non-integrated trusts, they spent time in each other's buildings. They were finishing each other's sentences in meetings, so that it was clear that they have got the relationships with them that extend beyond being in a Teams meeting together. Do you know what I mean? They were human beings together with a common cause. You felt that. And I'm sorry, it's not like a more specific answer for you, but perhaps there isn't a specific answer. Perhaps it's because they've proactively decided to feed a culture of team. That's the solution. Is that well? I know that's probably not helpful,
no,
but
thank you. No, I guess it's about whether you generate a common vision and start off with some kind of an integrated board, and then you work down the teams rather than it being, you know, a structure of board led, trust board led, having setting out your purpose and really driving that purpose maybe in a different way.
No, absolutely. Okay. And I think Mark and I are on the same page of this. We spent many times chatting on a train, is that all of us in healthcare, when you go off and do different roles, sometimes the distance between you and the shop floor grows. And that's just because it is what it is. There's no criticism of that. It just is. But actually, it's a personal choice to remain distant. And actually, perhaps the most credible, greatest people that we've met on these travels are ones that proactively diarise to make sure that they go back into all the parts that they connect with in their day job. They spend time with it, they live it, they see it, they smell it, they breathe it. Often very difficult to do, but it starts with a commitment. Well, I'm going to keep on trying to do that, because you just build up the soft stuff that we're talking by the corridor conversations, the kitchen conversations, the going for a Costa conversations, sitting in the nursing station conversations. Do you know what I mean? That's the cement of the brick wall. You can have the greatest bricks in the world, but if you don't have cement, then you can't build anything. But there you go. I'm waffling. I'll shut up.
Thank you.
I think one other thing, Beryl, it was kind of, there was a real, and Chris has referred to this, there was a real trust between the community and the acute sort of provider, and that kind of played out in terms of, you know, on board rounds, what could the community trust provide, and how can we actually tap into that? Because I think often the trust of actually what the community can provide and what it does provide is sometimes an issue. But there was a real strong theme of trust going through these 11 organisations in terms of how they worked with, you know, between each other.
Absolutely.
So maybe have the conversation, the paperwork follows, rather than we'll wait for the paperwork. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, thank you. It's really helpful.
You're very welcome, Beryl. So before we finish off with going to Rebecca, I've noticed that there is a question in the chat from Michael, is that do you think limited estate availability for SDEC or admission assessment areas can slow progress in addressing acute flow? My personal take is, of course, it can. And the second part is have the 11 also had big battles finding space in the right place? So I've looked through the attendance list, and I don't want to pick anybody out, but they're welcome to chip in. Is that I think that they would all say that estate is prime on a hospital site, and everybody is battling is probably the wrong word, but they're battling to, well, what do you back? And I think what's come out of our presentation, Mark, you chip in too, is that they've decided what they're going to prioritise. And the big theme that came out of the admitted flow piece is, let's make sure that people don't come to hospital in the first place. And if they do, have we got front door non-admitted pathway services in place that stop the admission? And that means that you can't have a functional SDEC per se without an SDEC facility that is meeting the demand that you require of it. So I've not said that properly. I think you knew what I meant, though. You can't. A cupboard can't facilitate 100 patients, and so that they've decided as a system, as a hospital, what are they going to prioritise? Mark, did you want to add anything? Or
no, that's fine. Thanks, Chris.
Nothing. Michael, you're nodding.
Yeah, thanks. It's, in your point there, Chris, around getting the right capacity to meet the demand. The hospitals I've worked in have a cupboard, if you like, something that's there, ticks the box to say they've got an SDEC, but actually it's not able to manage the demand. And then it's having that resilience as well. So there's something around managing demand during normal hours, but then what about the peaks? Because I've noticed hospitals I've worked in, the queues start when the peaks happen, and out of hours, the queues really start coming out. And at those, when the queues start, everything winds its way back round to ED. And as we know, longer stay in ED results in longer stay in the hospital. So it's that self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think you're right. So I think it starts with, if I do the root bit, probably really robust analysis of demand, to then, you know, with some assumptions, getting that scale of what's needed at SDEC and the assessment areas right. So yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think all of these organisations that have been successful have got everybody in a room. And so that there is that 360 conversation about what's the right thing to do. But yeah, thanks, Michael. Rebecca, we're finishing with you.
Yeah, and similar sort of theme, really. Something we're really wanting to explore at the moment is maximising the opportunities for trusted assessor. So we're doing things quite well with some of the exclusion criteria, but there's obviously a really big benefit in getting that trusted assessor model in place for patient flow and timeliness. And so we can move from the refer and accept to identify and send. But obviously we recognise there's a lot of nervousness around that. Was there anything in particular picked up from the providers you've been to as to how they went about building those relationships to build the trust between the services to get to that position of identify and send as opposed to refer and accept?
So I will think about that after this presentation, and I'll get back in touch with you with places. I'm sure Mark will do the same, because my answer I don't think is going to be helpful to you, Rebecca, specifically. My gut instinct is that it's the fact that they're all over each other's business is what's helpful. Is the fact that primary, community, urgent, acute are all in amongst each other and really understand it, but they see the whites of each other's eyes, they see what they're all dealing with, and they get to know each other as humans. And so that you build a relationship of trust, because I know you, Rebecca, I trust you, I've worked with you, and actually I know what goes on in your head. I understand you're competent and I trust you. And so therefore, if you say you've got a patient for me, I've got no reason to go behind that. But then perhaps at a senior level, they have discussions. Well, do you think Rebecca's incompetent? Because if you do, then let's do something about that. But if you don't think she's incompetent, why are you worried about her decision? And I think it's maybe around those lines, but it's definitely that cultural piece again. Mark. Yeah. And you can finish off, Mark, as well.
I probably don't answer to Becca's question, really, but I'm just on a final reflection, really, because we're very keen to look at the work of Patrick Lencioni when he looks at high-performing organisations and what characteristics make up these organisations. And it was really clear for me around the 11 that they have a high degree of trust, they have a shared vision and a commitment, and they're able to deal with conflict and to seek out conflict in improving patient pathways and patient care. So I think we don't have to go too far in terms of what are the main characteristics, but it was quite clear that that was borne out in these 11 visits. And I would say again that it all was based on trust.
Thank you.
Well, that's it then. We're at time, aren't we, Mark? But thank you very much for coming. We hope that these kind of visits are useful to you. If there is any particular part of the UEC pathway that you think that you would find it useful for us to repeat, so well, who's good out there and what are they doing, stick them in the chat or email Mark and I separately. And also, if you would like introductions to any of the organisations based on a specific element, then that's Mark and my job all the way through, is to try and network for you and do introductions if you're trying to accomplish something. But you've got 3 minutes to have a pee, and if you don't need a pee, you're not drinking enough, so have a cup of tea, but look after yourselves. Thank you very much.